Welcome back to the Sportsnaut interview. We continue to talk about horse racing, the second leg of the Triple Crown, the Preakness Stakes, the 149th Preakness Stakes, coming up at Baltimore's Pimlico Race Course. And to talk about that from bloodhorse.com, we bring in their editor, Byron King. Byron, of course, we saw last week Kentucky Derby, Mystik Dan wins it. What's the latest decision on whether or not they're going to enter Mystik Dan into the Preakness?
Well, it's looking more and more favorable that he's going to run. For your viewers and listeners that are unfamiliar with the Triple Crown, it's a series of 3 races that take place over 5 weeks, and there's only a short 2-week turnaround from the Kentucky Derby into the Preakness. And in the old days, that used to be something that horses would do all the time. They'd run that back that quickly. But nowadays, most horses are spaced a month apart between races. So trainers like to monitor their condition, make sure they're not fatigued and wiped out from a hard race. And obviously the Derby was a taxing race. I mean, we had 3 horses noses apart, horses, jockeys giving everything they had. So he certainly had a right to look a little bit tired. I saw him the day after the race and he looked like he had a long night. That's the best way to describe how he looked,
Yeah, you talked about trainers. So Kenny McPeak, obviously with Mystik Dan, what has he said? What does he think he needs to see from the horse before they decide whether or not to enter him at Pimlico?
Well, what typically happens with a horse that, say, runs on a Saturday is they'll have about 3 or 4 days off where they'll just kind of walk the barn. So in Mystik Dan's case, he went back to training yesterday on Wednesday and so had a gallop. So you're looking for energy. You're looking, does he look wiped out or does he look like his old self? And then also, of course, naturally, you're looking for things that related to their physical health. A horse is just like a human athlete. Think of football players that compete on a Sunday. Some of them are going to be a little bit banged up after, and maybe they can't play the next Sunday, but some of them respond to treatments. You have everything, a swollen ankle that happens for a human athlete. It happens with horses too. So those are the kinds of things that come up that they have to weigh.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love that analogy you made to football because when you look at, and I happen to be a horse race fan. My wife's family was in the business and so on. And I think that a lot of folks don't necessarily, when they look at a horse, they see an animal, they don't see an athlete. And these horses are athletes. And we know last year, obviously, we had the tragedies down at Churchill Downs. Is there any discussion around lengthening the time between these Triple Crown races, or are they content with where it is right now and don't believe that that's a factor?
Well, there is some discussion of it. In fact, the Pimlico people, where the Preakness is held, would like to see it stretched out because they're kind of the odd one out. So what happens is most Derby horses will bypass the Preakness. We might have maybe a couple that run back in the Preakness, but most of them will wait the Belmont, which is the last leg. So it kind of gives them 5 weeks apart. But in order to maintain the series, if let's say they stretched them out and has spaced them out 1 month apart, you'd have to convince the Belmont people to move. They don't really want to move. And then there's also the history of it, right? I mean, the Triple Crown is this elusive prize. The best comparison I would have with this is be like trying to change some of the rules about baseball. I mean, there are baseball fans everywhere that would just, they might balk if you said, well, let's move back the outside fence, or let's change the dimensions of one thing or another, because people like to compare it to history. They like to compare, well, hey, we've only had 13 horses win the Triple Crown. It's supposed to be hard, so you have a mix of feelings on the matter. But as of right now, they can't get everybody on board in order to do that.
Yeah, the tradition there too, and the analogy with baseball is a good one because you find it with horse racing too, which is people like the tradition, especially when you're talking about the Triple Crown and the great horses who've won the Triple Crown did that. So it's sort of, people will say, well, they did it. Why can't we do it now? Even though we've kind of evolved, I think we understand much more about animal health and all of that. But when you look at the rest of the field for this Preakness, as we're talking today, we don't know yet, but are there any other horses from the Derby that you feel are favorably going to be in the field at Pimlico?
Well, there's a possibility that Just Steele,
Mm,
who was well beaten, could return. His trainer, Dwayne Lucas, of course, is a legend of the game, and he's old school, right? So he's more likely to run back on short rest. A lot of the more up and coming trainers are more like spacing type of strategies they like to utilize. But the main thing about the Preakness that makes it, I think, the biggest challenge for Mystik Dan would not be a horse returning from the Derby, but it'd be the fresh ones waiting in the wings.
mm,
And in that case, you have two Bob Baffert horses. Bob Baffert, for your viewers that are not aware, has been banned from competing in the Kentucky Derby
yes.
since Medina Spirit had a positive test in 2021. So he couldn't run his horses in the Kentucky Derby. Now, they were two horses, Muth and Imagination, that had the credentials to run. I mean, in terms of they would have been, Muth probably would have been the third favorite. Imagination would have been 15, 20 to 1.
Hmm.
And so now they're fresh. They don't have the hard race. So those horses, in my opinion, are going to pose the biggest obstacle if Mystik Dan competes and runs.
Well, you talk about Bob Baffert. Talk about his success over the years at the Preakness, because it's pretty remarkable.
It is. I mean, well, this is a man who is, one of the greats of the game in terms of what he's won. I mean, he's a polarizing figure because
Hmm.
of these medication violations and things of that nature. He's also had a series of high profile kind of horses that have gotten hurt or died and things. Medina Spirit, for example, is one. He had essentially what they think was a heart attack. So he is a polarizing figure, but he's also won a ton of stuff. I mean, he's kind of like, the Tom Brady of the horse racing world. I mean, he's synonymous with success and winning, right? And did Brady deflate the footballs? Well, he probably did, but he still won 7 Super Bowls,
He
right?
did.
And I think a lot of people might kind of put Baffert in that same kind of category.
Yeah, and I know he's going for back-to-back wins here, right? At Preakness, he's won there 8 times. What about his two horses in this race with Muth and Imagination? This track obviously is more narrow. The differences between this and Churchill Downs, different surface. Talk about the track differences and how Baffert's horses run on those conditions.
Well, his horses typically tend to be speedy types of horses. He likes horses that come out there running, and it isn't a big advantage. We saw how Mystik Dan was able to knife through along the inside to win the Kentucky Derby, but that's a trip that's hard to carve out, and it took
Mm.
a lot of fearless riding from Brian Hernandez to do that. But generally speaking, if you're up front early, right, you're kicking the dirt back and the horses behind you, and it's an advantage. You typically don't have to race as wide. So his horses are typically well suited to the Preakness. Muth and Imagination both have positional speed. They don't have to be in front, but they're naturally speedy, and they're also comfortable sitting second, third, fourth, that kind of a thing. So I would expect them to be quite tough. The Preakness is a little bit shorter than the Kentucky Derby. It's a mile and 3/16. So that potentially you might not need just as much stamina, but I mean, it's not a tremendous difference in distance, a 16th of a mile. But I think that clearly won't bother Mystik Dan. He looked like
Mhm.
he was kind of at his limit at a mile and a quarter. I mean, they were going to catch him in another jump or two. So it should suit him well, I would think. And it certainly will suit Baffert's horses as well.
Yeah. What is your opinion on some of the other horses that you're hearing might be in the field here? I know there's probables that we've seen and we've looked at, and would love to hear just some of the horses that you would tell our audience to maybe look out for as we head up to the announcement, as we head up and understand who the field is completely.
Yeah, well, right now, what they're trying to do is what these racing offices will do for a major race like this is they'll be calling up trainers and owners and saying, hey, we've only got about 6 or 7 confirmed. Will you take a chance? We'd love to have you run and that kind of thing. So they'll try to talk in some of the connections of these long shots to compete. Inevitably, you'll have a few local horses. We've seen through the years, sometimes a Maryland-based horse will really blow up the exotic wagering by running second, third, something like that in the Preakness. It's happened on occasion, but typically they're a little bit outgunned. You know, they're kind of moving from the minor leagues to the major leagues, and it's kind of a tough step up for them. But one of the horses I saw that was mentioned is a horse by the name of Uncle Heavy, who's got a kind of cool name, I think. But
it's a good
he's
one.
a horse that has shown some promise. They bypassed the Derby with him, and he's coming back here. But he had a nice race that he won over the winter in New York, and he's one of them. But honestly, a lot of times, some of these long shots, they're going to need some breaks along the way. They're going to need one of the favorites or to not fire. And that can happen. We saw in the Kentucky Derby, Fierceness, who was the favorite, was a no-show. So, it can happen. And last year, pointing to Mage, he was one of the Kentucky Derby winners that came back on 2 weeks rest. And I think he regressed a little bit, and he ran third in the Preakness. So sometimes these fresh horses can, elevate their game a little bit against some of the bigger names who maybe are a little bit wiped out.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I know I love this time of the year, and I think even people who might not be heavy in horse racing, they love not only the race, but obviously the pageantry leading up to it. There's so much involved with these races and those race weekends, as we saw last week at the Derby. So it's going to be fun. Byron, thanks for being with us. Make sure you watch or go read everything you want to know about horses and horse racing. Check out bloodhorse.com. And Byron, your X.com is at @BH_BKing. So make sure you follow Byron if you want the latest news from around the world of horse racing. Byron, enjoy the Preakness, and we'll catch up with you sometime down the line. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Evan.